If you're having a hard time finding sources that relate to your topic, don't worry. It's a little bit easier than you might think. Hey, good to see you. Not long ago, we talked about the importance of narrowing your writing to a really specific level, and we discussed how a narrower argument is more persuasive because it's more doable. You know, trying to get someone to fix a whole house is a lot more difficult than trying to get them to replace a doorknob. And the more specific you are, the more likely it is that your audience will be able to know and do what you want them to do. So it's ultimately in your best interest to write an argument that's as specific as possible, but that can create some difficulties, especially when it comes to finding sources to support your claims. If you're writing about a specific problem, it's really not too likely that you'll be able to find sources that explicitly have to do with your specific topic. But guess what? That's okay, and by the end of the video, we'll see that it's actually a good thing. But it's reasonable to worry that you're going to make your research process more difficult when you write about something more specific. So today I want to do some problem solving and share some strategies that can help you to find good sources when you're writing about something specific but are having trouble finding sources about that topic. And to do it, we'll use a paper that I wrote a long time ago. Not because it's especially amazing or anything, but just because I happen to know a lot about how it got put together. Okay, we've talked about this paper before, but when I was in college, I had to write about food. Part of the challenge of the assignment was to come up with a more specific topic and argument that fit under that broad theme. Well, as I was trying to figure out what specifically to write about, I realized that there was a farmer's market that got set up on campus once a week, and I also realized that I had never been to it. In fact, nobody I knew had ever been to it. To me then, it seemed like that farmer's market could potentially have been a really cool resource for students, but it was clearly being underutilized. So I had to do some basic research just to learn enough about the farmer's market to know what kinds of arguments I could even make, and then I would have to find sources to support the claims that I would eventually try to make. Obviously, I wasn't going to find any peer-reviewed journal articles about that particular farmer's market, or any studies that talked about how students on my campus could be encouraged to participate, but I also didn't have to. In the end, I found some sources that I thought would do the trick, and my teacher thought so too. As I look back on that paper, I realized that there are a few principles that were guiding my decision process as I looked for sources, and I'm pretty confident that these strategies can also help you to find more effective sources when you're writing a particularly specific argument. When you're writing a research paper, you may be required to include a certain number of peer-reviewed sources. But that doesn't mean that all of your sources need to be peer-reviewed. In fact, if you're doing a good job of writing a specific practical argument, you may have some trouble finding peer-reviewed sources to include in your argument. I mean, what are the odds that a team of academics has researched and published a paper about your exact topic? Obviously, I wasn't going to find any peer-reviewed sources specifically about my school's farmer's market, but I did need some sources about it, so I started looking in local newspapers and on the university's website, and I ended up finding some pretty useful things. For example, I found some newspaper interviews with vendors and university officials who were involved in the farmer's market, and on the university website, I found some of the educational resources that were being used in order to help engage students. When it comes to reputable sources, peer-reviewed sources are generally treated as the gold standard, and that's because they have to be looked over by other professionals before they ever get published, so it's more likely that they'll contain high-quality information. But it's also because a lot of papers get written in academic settings, and peer review is an academic process. But peer review isn't the only way to measure a source's value. My local sources weren't peer-reviewed, but that didn't really matter because they included the words of people who were actually involved in my local farmer's market. In that case, interviews with actual participants could be more valuable than the peer-reviewed research of scholars from another state. So when you're working with specific arguments, there's nothing wrong with starting with smaller, more local sources. If you're trying to understand an issue that affects a specific community, it makes a lot of sense to go to that community and not to distant researchers in order to figure out what's going on. Of course, you'll eventually want some more quote-unquote rigorous sources, and that leads us into our next point. After I had a good understanding of what was going on at the farmer's market, I decided that the best strategy for making better use of its resources would be to simplify the recipes in its educational materials and to find a way to provide a financial incentive for students to visit. And it's great that I had that idea, but I was going to need to find some sources that would help me to show that my proposal might actually work. And to do that, I then turned to peer-reviewed sources. But it's important to point out that there were no peer-reviewed articles about encouraging college students to attend farmers markets, at least not at the time, so I wasn't going to be able to find sources that specifically supported the claims I was trying to make. Instead, I was going to have to look for sources that talked about similar situations to mine, and then explain how those sources could support the claims that I was making. And that's exactly what I did. For example, I couldn't find any sources about incentivizing college students to attend farmers markets, but I did find a study where seniors were given vouchers to attend a farmers market for the first time. After receiving that one-time financial incentive, the seniors were more likely to go back for subsequent visits. And sure, seniors are not college students, but it's reasonable to think that if one-time vouchers could help one group of people to attend a farmers market more regularly, they could also encourage another group to go. So I filed that source away and spent some time in my paper explaining how one-time vouchers could feasibly be used to encourage students to go to the farmers market for the first time, thereby creating more opportunities for people to go more often. In addition to that, I also found a resource from another university that had a bunch of recipes designed to help low-income parents prepare convenient and healthy foods for their families. Again, not college students and not a farmer's market, but my school's market was on record saying that they were trying to help students develop healthier lifestyles through cooking, so that resource seemed like a good place to start. See, for all the differences that there could be between low-income parents and college students, there are also some useful similarities, like restrictive budgets and tight schedules. So I used the simple and effective recipes from the other school as a model for mine, and spent some time in my paper explaining why the recipes that my school was currently demonstrating were way too complex and elaborate for a majority of the student population. Instead, I proposed that the farmers market could benefit from showcasing more accessible recipes, which would make it easier for students to cook with the foods that they bought at the market, and make it more likely that those dietary changes would stick in the midst of a busy student lifestyle. And those sources illustrate the value of thinking analogically. You don't have to find sources that address the exact topic that you're writing about. If you can find solid sources that address very similar things, it's really reasonable to make connections. Of course, you can't just say if it worked for parents, it'll work for students. You'll have to spend some time in your paper just to find the connections that you make so that your readers don't pick a fight with you, but that's something you can totally do. And it's a great way to find sources to support your argument if you're having a hard time finding any that address your specific topic. This third principle didn't feature too prominently in my farmers market paper, but it's something that happens a lot in academic writing and other forms of persuasion, and it's to find sources that discuss significant ideas or concepts that you can then apply to your specific argument. For example, last time we talked about Wayne Booth's The Company We Keep, and I mentioned that I'm using his insights in a research project that I'm currently working on. In my project, I'm studying the ways that science communicators on YouTube relate to their audiences, and I'm thinking about those relationships in terms similar to what Booth talks about when he says that we're spending time with the people whose creative work we consume. So Booth never wrote specifically about YouTube or science channels or anything like that, but his essay did discuss more general concepts that are applicable to the things that I'm working on. So I cite him not because he wrote about the exact same topic that I'm writing about, but because he wrote about general concepts that help me to understand the specific cases that I'm working on. And you can do that in your writing too. So instead of looking for sources that talk directly about your specific topic, you can find sources that propose general ideas that help you to understand your specific topic more deeply. It's true that finding sources may be a little trickier when you're writing a specific argument, but that's not a reason to write about something broad and general. You see, it may not be the most valuable thing to write about a topic that there are already a lot of sources about. That's because it's important when you're writing to make a unique contribution, even if it's a small and simple one. And that's just not going to happen if all you're doing is rehashing the things that other people have already said. In other words, if you're writing about something and there are already a whole bunch of sources written about that topic, it's going to be more difficult to say something new and useful about it. But if you're having trouble finding sources, that may be a sign that you've found an opportunity to say something new and make a contribution that hasn't been made before. A while ago, I shared the advice to tell the stories that only you can. It's good advice for fiction, but it works just as well for persuasive writing. Instead of making an argument that somebody else has already made, you could just forward that original source to your readers. No, if you're going to go to the trouble of writing a paper, at least make sure you're saying something that only you could. If you're doing that, you may have some trouble finding sources that address your specific topic. But you can still write persuasively and use your other sources effectively if you expand your search to include sources that are smaller or more local, sources that address similar or related situations, and sources that explain broad concepts that are applicable to your specific topic. So get out there and find some good sources in unexpected places, and you can tell me all about it when we meet up again next week.